very brief introduction to the collection that I provided for the book. Here's also the pills without the, the numbers, without the pills around. So it's basically two different strands of work. I called it Ephemera Forever. This title suggests that many works in the field of cyberfeminism have not been artworks in the traditional sense, but took many different forms, often ephemeral, as for example networks, meetings, workshops, performances, or research activities such as interviews, etc. For the collection, each curator, if I may call them curator, provided also a little introduction, and I think I just would like to read this introduction to you. This collection very much refers to works that are part of my own practice as an artist and researcher. Since my early involvement in cyberfeminism in the mid-90s, I had a special interest in the relationship between gender and technology. Inspired by Judy Weitzman's dicta that technology is never neutral and that technology is a highly gendered field, one of my interests was the exploration of the technical underground, the hacker scene, where gender imbalance was and still is most extreme. The frustrating findings of such ethnographic research led me to artistic interventions in the field, whose aim was to manipulate the dynamics by social hacks and spreading false information, or to add complexity to a black and white situation. Another strand, oh yeah, I think that referred to the works here. I just quickly go through, and if you're interested, you can look them up in the index, which luckily is also online, not only printed. So the first work I would like to mention from this more ephemeral kind of interventionist characters is Female Extension from 1997. It was the hack into a museum art competition. It was the first competition of a museum, of an art museum, for internet art. And I decided to mark this very specific moment when the net art scene, which was like free floating and which defined itself by being independent from the parameters of traditional art world, met kind of the criteria of such a competition that was launched by the Museum for Contemporary Art, Hamburger Kunsthalle, in '97. And to hack this for hacking this competition, I invited 300 fictitious female net artists, and I tried to flood the competition with this overwhelming number of female net artists. I'm not going into detail with that, some people know it already, but related to this intervention much later, 20 years later, from 2017, also on Cyberfeminism Index is an interview with Michael Connor from Rhizome, flooding the museum. And he decided, Rhizome edited the net art anthology, and he decided to include Female Extension as an early piece of interventionist net art, and we talked about this work 20 years later. And that already shows a little bit my history is very long-standing with cyberfeminism. I think it starts in 1996 at Ars Electronica, where I met V&S Matrix for the first time. And so my whole presentation is not so much a narrative, but it's like a jumping back and forth. You know, I go back in history, but I also find it very important to not just tell the history, but really contextualize and frame it and criticize from today's point of view. So another very early work from 1999, already mentioned, the women hackers. I did a research. I was a member of the Chaos Computer Club in the 90s, and at one point I realized, only after a few years, I have to admit, that there were no females in the Chaos Computer Club. And I thought, is this coincidence, or you know, what does it mean? And there must be some. So I started research for half a year I went to all the conferences, to DEF CON, Chaos Communication Congress, and all these events. And I couldn't really, and I also subscribed to all the relevant mailing lists, and I came in touch with really amazing people, like the US American hacker prosecutor I interviewed, and a lot of other people, science fiction authors like Bruce Sterling. We talked about, are there female hackers or not? The result was very frustrating. I could hardly find any. I was told if women are involved in hacking, then it's fraud. They are just interested in money and not in the technology. So I was very frustrated because I had imagined this like wild, crazy, anarchic, tech-savvy female hacker. And then I switched mode from research to artist, and I started to invent these hackers by interviewing them. So I started to do a series of video interviews with non-existing hackers. And one example, an interview with Clara Soft, is this video, Have Script Will Destroy, which now, since 6 months or so, is also on YouTube. So that is number 198. An interview with Jenny Marchetto, a New York-based new media artist, also on hacking and art. And what I called, how did I call it earlier in the description, add complexity to a black and white situation. Black and white situation is you often get if you address this gender technology issue in the techno underground. And you all know about the case of Julian Assange, which is on now for many years, and it's very ambivalent, it's very complex, it's very difficult, but it's also a kind of a black and white. People either hate him or they love him, they support him or they dismiss his work. And there was this case, this supposed rape story. And of course, as a techno-feminist, I was thinking like, what's going on? And I was talking to other techno-feminists, cyber-feminists for many years, but no one really felt like engaging with me and producing a work. So eventually, after some years, in 2018, I decided to do this lecture performance, À la recherche de l'information perdue, which is a techno-feminist commentary on the Julian Assange case. And I also don't go so much into detail, but the whole supposed or alleged rape story is about a broken condom. So I thought this is a nice image to start with, and I use it as a background image. And I very much work around this short cut between leaking information and leaking genetic information. And it's also, I performed it several times, and last time at the Chaos Communication Congress, and they filmed it and put it online. So if you're interested in going into more detail, and it's not really pro or against, it's really kind of adding a context and embedding this whole story in a larger cultural discourse. So the other strand of works that I have put into my collection, is the building of context for techno-feminist collaboration and exchange. The founding of the Old Boys Network has already been mentioned, took place in the tradition of the early feminist art collective Frauen in Technik, Women in Technology and Innen, which we started in Hamburg, where you presented yesterday, and eventually inspired recent activities of the techno-feminist research group Purple Noise, that is dedicated to explore the continuities between the physical and the virtual space. So I have some slides that I'm running through. Old Boys Network, just so this was like the pre-history of Old Boys Network, Women in Technology, a group from 1992. It's exactly how long? 30 years? Okay, yeah, it's annoying. And I contrasted this image of Innen with this one of Vienna's Matrix. because we met in '96, as I already said, in Ars Electronica. A mutual friend introduced us and said, Inen should meet VNS Metrics, something might happen if you meet. And it did. We became friends, and we're still friends now. So the manifesto has already been mentioned, and it's very powerful poetic language, I would say. And it's important to stress that it's poetry and that it's not technological intervention, it's not code, it's not media praxis, it's poetry, you know, it's working with language. And you also have to keep in mind it's 1992. It was pre-web. And Sadie Plant as well. And I talk about these two approaches because it's not like these approaches were not undefined. They defined cyberfeminism in a certain way, but we came afterwards. Oh, yeah, the way they decided, I put two quotes here. There is a decided shift in the woman-machine relationship because there is a shift in the nature of machines. Zeros now have a place and they displace the phallic order of ones. That is basically after Sadie Plant. So that is her thinking and what she kind of elaborated in her book Zeros and Ones. The growth of the net has been continuous with the way it works. No central hub or command structure has constructed it, and its emergence has rather been that of a parasite than an organizing host. According to this view, new technologies not only subvert the male identity, even more exciting is the possibility of inventing endless new identities, thus undermining binary heteronormative subjectivities. That is also Weitzman. And I use this quote because she puts a huge emphasis on identity, and I think that was very important for 90s cyberfeminism, to play with identities and the cyberspace. But then also, of course, there was criticism necessary. And in her book, Techno-Feminism, Judy Weitzman was, I think, the first serious critique of cyberfeminism, especially the cyberfeminism of Sadie Plant, I have to say, because we, Old Boys Network, and what followed after, we tried to go away from this very body-focused, identity-focused on the relationship to cyberfeminism. The critique goes as follows. It's a version of radical or cultural feminism dressed up as cyberfeminism and is similarly essentialist. That's very important critique. The belief in some inner essence of womanhood as an ahistorical category lies at the very heart of traditional and conservative conceptions of womanhood. What is curious is that Plant holds on to this fixed unitary version of what is to be female, while at the same time arguing that the self is decentered and dispersed. So that is important because very often cyberfeminism is quoted today, again, just the poetic language of powerful language of VNS Matrix, without really contextualizing it in the time, and that there are so many shifts also in theory and in practice have come afterwards, and also the environment completely has changed in the last 30 years, so this has to be considered. But here I brought up the Cyberfeminist Manifesto, the Old Boys Network, the 100 Antitheses, and they have been famous, and they kind of, what you already mentioned, Mindy, express this idea of the Old Boys Network. I have to say that we decided not to define cyberfeminism. We built this platform, Old Boys Network, and we wanted it to be an open platform and welcome, be as inclusive, as you said, as possible, by not defining it, and just see what do people want cyberfeminism to be, and then put it on the table and start a discussion. And this was exactly what we did at the first Cyberfeminist International in Kassel. We made an open call, and we said, bring your approach to cyberfeminism, tell us what you want cyberfeminism to be, and you can present it. And we managed to really invite everyone who had an approach. In '97 it was 36 people, Today it would be probably a few more. And from there the work continued, and it was very contested, this notion of not defining what does it actually mean, and I'll talk about that also in a minute. Here is this very important book, Techno-Feminism, by Judy Weitzman from 2004. I think it's sold out, but you can get some pirate copies in the special library, some special libraries. At this point, as I already said, I think I just read some quotes from the book, The Beautiful Warriors, some lines, because I reread it and I thought it's the best way I put it, and so it's very dense and it says everything that I still find relevant. The conditions of digital network technologies inspired the cyberfeminism of the 90s. Maybe I choose another, yeah. The conditions of digital network technologies inspired the cyberfeminism of the 90s and fueled it to proclaim undreamt of techno-hybrid identities, and thus to evoke a new and intimate relationship between women and technology. Subsequent criticism of dangerous essentialism of the early approaches by Sadie Plant and VNS Matrix, or the insufficient political self-identification of the Old Boys Network, here we go, failed to recognize just how effective the concept and the political imaginaries associated with it actually were, even though, or perhaps because, it kept away from any simplistic understanding of politics, but instead pulled out all the stops for queering. There was never a cyberfeminism or the cyberfeminism, but rather a multitude of feminist, techno-utopian visions from a variety of disciplines and with a wide range of content, and these visions found a platform with the Old Boys Network where they could become visible and develop in proximity to one another. After OBN discontinued its activities in 2001, there was no longer an overarching forum. The various practices retreated back to their respective contexts, which weakened their ability to reach broader audience. Despite the vagueness associated with it, the concept of cyberfeminism has continued to play and is yet again playing an important role in the search for new techno-feminist approaches, be it an object of nostalgic romanticizing, as an object of critique directed toward its inconsistent political strategies, or as a historical reference to what was then a new era of combining technology and gender. Accordingly, the new wave of interest in cyberfeminism, which began around 2014, maybe, I don't know, if you observed this as well, we can talk about that, is heterogeneous as well, alongside uncritical and nostalgic attempts to revive cyberfeminism without taking into account the techno-material and techno-political conditions that have since changed, events such as the Post-Cyberfeminist International or the first interrupted Sci-Fem and Queer Festival here in Berlin have aimed to combine historical approaches with current practices and to formulate new theoretical positions on the basis of praxis. Meanwhile, an entirely independent concept of cyberfeminism has been developed in Latin America, for instance, where cyberfeminist activities have explicitly defined themselves against their theoretical precursors and have based their understanding of the term exclusively on their own practices. The new interest in cyberfeminism is a good starting point for promoting urgently needed contextualizing engagement, for comparing the historical positions of the 90s with their current iterations, and not least for examining the potential of the concept for approaches that have yet to be developed. What can the concept of cyberfeminism still accomplish today? Can it be adjusted to today's changed conditions? Or would it be more sensible to abandon it in favor of new concepts? In any case, it's necessary when using the term to provide some indication of how it's being understood. So that should be enough. It's part of the introduction to the book. And as I said, in 2014, there was like a revived interest in cyberfeminism, and all of a sudden I got one invitation after the other to speak about the Old Boys Network, like the grandmother of cyberfeminism, I felt. And I said, okay, yeah, I can do that. I did it several times, and it was contrasted to really contemporary approaches, and I said, something is not working here at all. And I felt very uncomfortable, and I thought, okay, I cannot just present what we have done back then. It really needs to be recontextualized. And the result of this process is basically this book, where I said, okay, we revisit, and it's very important work that we did. You know, we build a ground for something. Also, as I said, in 2001, I don't know if you can also see it in the index, I had the feeling the activities are going down a little bit. It was a lot of activity. It became very quiet. And all of a sudden there was a new interest from obviously a new generation. And they were revisiting the stuff from the 90s in a very uncritical way, you know, just consuming this really rich poetry. And I thought, well, guys, you know, times change. We cannot look at the internet in such a naive way as we did in the mid-90s, you know. The internet and the whole network technology is a completely different field at the moment. We have serious problems, you know, and poetry alone will not help us. I mean, I love poetry, it's fantastic to motivate. So so there was, in the introduction is some reflection about this, what happened in between the different shifts, and then I was looking around and because myself also, I had kind of been concerned with other things in the meantime. I said, okay, what is the continuation of this spirit, you know, what's going on? And I tried to capture a few of these approaches in this book. And one, for example, one text is by Christina Grammatikopoulou. She is really exploring this continuity between the physical space and the virtual space, which was no issue at all in the 90s. Everything was about cyberspace, and no one was thinking about how these two spaces relate. And of course, today with social media and protests, you know, reflecting online and reflecting back to the street and all, there's a completely different continuity. Spider Alex is creating new worlds with cyberfeminist practices and imaginaries. She's a techno trainer, and she traveled the world doing techno, you know, critical workshops in many contexts, and she gave the space I dedicated to her in the book, or I gave her in the book, to the Latin American initiatives, cyberfeminist initiatives that I mentioned earlier, which was for me mind-blowing to read what's going on. They're completely different reality, completely different societies. We cannot imagine kind of violence and what's going on, and how cyberfeminist initiatives there use technology to get organized and do something. Femke Snelting is free software activist and a designer. She's in the group Libre Graphics. They do graphic design only with open source software. You can imagine how painful that is, but they do it. Performing, I did an interview with her, performing graphic design practice, because it's performing graphic design practice. It's not just doing the practice. And within this context of Libre Graphics, where people with really an attitude towards technology, she at some point realized that there is a need for a code of conduct, because there were also a lot of problems. And she writes about this process of together developing a code of conduct. So that are some insights into this book. The last one, maybe, which is important to mention, is by Yvonne Folcott, because she was also a member of the Old Boys Network, so we have also a long-standing working relationship and are in a continuous dialogue. And she was very much, from early on, involved in ecological issues, which is not so much my focus, but she managed really to bring those two fields of technology and ecology together in a wonderful way, and also in a way where I think what is also different now from the 90s, and we cannot pretend that we dissolve in the cyberspace and just floating around in zeros and ones and choosing our identities, whatever we like, you know. We have to look where we stand, and we have to see what the implications of technologies are on societies, and how these implications again have an impact on us. And there's huge ecological issues related to technology, and she suggests the term eco-techno-feminism for that, and starts to develop the concept in this book. So that is the book. And yeah, I also, you know, in this process of reflecting about Old Boys Network, I started to write several texts and gave talks and so on and so forth. One talk, at one point, the VNS Metrics told me that they got a huge grant from the Australian government to build their archive. And I was super envious and said, wow, you know, you have all this money and you can now archive your work, and I'm really envious. And we should do that also with Old Boys Network, because, you know, I think the work was somehow relevant, and it's not much left except this original website from 2000, which is funny to look at. Yeah, it still works, it's just HTML, so that's the advantage. And I started to complain in my presentations about, you know, that there is no archive, and also because my frustrations to talk to young people, okay, but they cannot know better because they cannot access the material, and there's no way that they can learn about the spirit of the time, and that causes a lot of misunderstandings. And at one point, you know, it was at the Kunsthochschule in Kassel where I was invited to speak, and Professor Nora Sternfeld, it made her think, you know, she didn't talk to me at all about this project, but one day I got a phone call and she said, we have the money. And I said, what for? And she said, yeah, for the Old Boys Network archive. And wow. So that's what I've been involved in the last year, 2 years, basically, the very difficult issue of archiving a network. I'll stop in a minute. But this is, again, you know, it's a very current work, but it's also, you know, jumping back and forth, and this difficulty of it was a network, and how can you archive a network, and a lot of issues that I'm sure you also had to deal with, you know, decision, inclusion, exclusion, how do you do it, how do you make your decision-making processes transparent, and so on and so forth. And of course, somebody is always excluded and complains afterwards. So it was very difficult. We tried to do our best, and the good thing really is, maybe I have some images. The good thing is that we had our first conference, the first Cyberfeminism International in '97 in Kassel at the Documenta. And Nora was Documenta professor at the time, and she made contact with the Documenta Archiv. It's an institution in Kassel whose purpose is to archive what's happening around Documenta. And their new director, Birgitta Kurs, she was totally enthusiastic about the project. And so we are working on this archive, and this, again, you know, it's kind of going back. It's like a therapy sometimes. You know, go back and I thought, oh God, there was all these traumatic things happening, and shall we revive this or not? And so on and so forth. Everyone knows that who works in groups and self-organized contexts. It's not easy. And our slogan was, the mode is the message, the code is the collective. So we try to do our best. Yeah, I don't know. I think I just stop here. This was a bit of, you know, jumping back and forth. And for the archiving, I did a wonderful spreadsheet with, I don't know how many hundreds of entries. It's almost as thick as your book. So we have to combine them. We have to merge them. Yes, at one point. So that's very interesting, because it's, you know, it makes, or it's the opportunity to rethink also what we have done back then, what is the meaning of today, how can it be transformed into something else still meaningful, and also what can we give now, you know, my generation to the next generation, what is meaningful for them to continue. Yeah. I think that's it, basically. Yeah, and as part of the archiving process, we also made these postcards of the Old Boys Network. Hand out. We had several presentations.